Picture this. You're deep in the Pacific Northwest wilderness, miles from the nearest road. The Douglas firs tower above you like natural skyscrapers, their canopy so thick that even midday feels like dusk. The only sounds are your breathing, the crunch of pine needles under your boots, and the occasional call of a distant bird. Then you hear it, a sound that doesn't belong. A long, guttural howl that seems to resonate from somewhere primal, something that makes the hair on your neck stand up and your ancestors' survival instincts kick in. In that moment, you're not thinking about science or skepticism. You're wondering, could it be real? This is the power of Bigfoot, America's most famous cryptid, a legend that has captivated imaginations, launched countless expeditions, spawned a multi-million-dollar industry, and created communities of believers who dedicate their lives to proving what science says cannot exist. But Bigfoot is more than just a monster story. It's a cultural phenomenon that reveals something profound about the American psyche, our relationship with wilderness, our need for mystery in an increasingly explained world, and our deep-seated desire to believe that something wild and untamed still exists beyond the reach of modern civilization. For those unfamiliar with the legend, Bigfoot, also known as Sasquatch, is described as a large, bipedal, ape-like creature that allegedly inhabits the forests of North America, particularly in the Pacific Northwest. Witnesses describe a creature standing 7 to 9 feet tall, weighing between 500 and 900 pounds, covered in dark brown or reddish hair, with a pronounced brow ridge, a flat nose, and enormous feet that leave tracks measuring up to 24 inches long. The creature is said to be elusive, avoiding human contact, primarily nocturnal, and possessing an intelligence that allows it to evade capture despite thousands of reported sightings spanning centuries. But these dry, clinical descriptions don't capture what Bigfoot really represents. To believers, this creature is proof that science doesn't have all the answers, that the natural world still holds secrets, and that the wilderness can still be genuinely wild. To skeptics, Bigfoot represents the power of folklore, the human tendency toward pattern recognition and misidentification, and our eternal fascination with the unknown. To anthropologists and folklorists, Bigfoot is a window into how myths evolve, how communities form around shared beliefs, and how ancient legends adapt to modern contexts. In an age where we can see virtually any corner of the earth through satellite imagery, where drones can explore the deepest caves and the densest jungles, where environmental DNA can detect species' presence from a single drop of water, the persistence of the Bigfoot legend might seem anachronistic. Yet the legend has never been more alive. Tens of thousands of people claim to have seen Bigfoot. Organizations like the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization maintain databases with thousands of reported encounters. Television shows dedicated to Bigfoot hunting draw millions of viewers. Tourism industries in supposed Bigfoot hotspots generate substantial revenue. Books, documentaries, and films continue to explore the legend from every conceivable angle. The question isn't really whether Bigfoot exists. The overwhelming consensus of scientific evidence suggests it does not. The more interesting question is, why do we need Bigfoot to exist? What role does this legend play in contemporary American culture? What does our relationship with this cryptid reveal about our values, our fears, and our dreams? Bigfoot is fundamentally an American legend, though it has cousins around the world. The Yeti of the Himalayas, the Yowie of Australia, the Almas of Central Asia. But the American version has its own distinct character, shaped by the unique history and mythology of the United States. The legend emerged from the frontier experience, from the encounter between European settlers and the vast, intimidating wilderness of the North American continent. It carries within it the tension between civilization and wildness, between the known and the unknown, between human mastery and nature's mystery. The American frontier was always as much a psychological space as a physical one. It represented opportunity and danger, freedom and lawlessness, possibility and death. As the physical frontier closed at the end of the 19th century, famously declared closed by historian Frederick Jackson Turner in 1893, the American imagination needed new frontiers to explore. Bigfoot provided one such frontier, A reminder that no matter how much we map and measure and catalog, there might still be something out there beyond our understanding. This is why Bigfoot sightings concentrate in areas that still feel remote and wild. The dense forests of the Pacific Northwest, the Appalachian Mountains, the swamps of the Deep South. These are America's last remaining wildernesses, places where cell phone reception fades, where you can still get genuinely lost, where nature feels bigger than human presence. If Bigfoot exists anywhere, these are the places it would exist, the last refuges from the relentless advance of civilization. Belief in Bigfoot operates on multiple levels, and understanding these levels is crucial to understanding the phenomenon itself. At the most basic level are the casual believers, people who think it's possible that an undiscovered primate species could exist in remote regions, who find the evidence intriguing without necessarily dedicating their lives to the search. This group probably represents the majority of Americans who, according to various polls, believe Bigfoot might be real. Then there are the committed believers, individuals who have had personal experiences they interpret as Bigfoot encounters, or who have studied the evidence and become convinced of the creature's existence. These are the people who organize expeditions, maintain databases, analyze footprints and hair samples, and engage in ongoing debates about the nature and behavior of the creature. For them, Bigfoot is not a maybe, but a certainty waiting for final proof. Beyond these are what we might call the experiencers, people whose claimed encounters with Bigfoot have become central to their identity and worldview. These individuals often describe profound, life-changing experiences that go beyond simply seeing an unusual animal. Some describe telepathic communication, spiritual experiences, or ongoing relationships with Bigfoot families. For them, Bigfoot is not primarily a scientific question, but a personal truth that exists independently of mainstream acceptance. Finally, there are the cultural participants, people who may not necessarily believe in Bigfoot's physical existence, but who enjoy the legend, participate in Bigfoot-related tourism and entertainment, and appreciate the phenomenon as folklore. This group recognizes that whether Bigfoot is real or not, the legend itself is real and valuable as a cultural artifact. Over the course of this comprehensive exploration, we will trace the Bigfoot legend from its deepest roots in indigenous American traditions through its evolution into a modern phenomenon that spans science, pseudoscience, folklore, entertainment, and digital culture. We'll examine the most famous evidence and the most compelling debunkings. We'll explore the regional variations of the legend and the communities that have formed around it. We'll investigate the scientific attempts to prove or disprove Bigfoot's existence and the reasons those attempts have failed to settle the question for believers. Most importantly, we'll ask what the Bigfoot legend reveals about America itself. Our relationship with nature, our attraction to mystery, our resistance to purely materialistic explanations of reality, and our need for stories that remind us the world is bigger and stranger than our daily lives might suggest. Whether you're a believer, a skeptic, or somewhere in between, the Bigfoot phenomenon has something to teach us about who we are and what we value. The legend of Bigfoot is America's own mythology, as distinctive as any ancient epic, as revealing as any cultural tradition. It deserves to be taken seriously not because the creature is real, but because our belief in it, or our desire for it to be real, tells us something profound about the American experience. So let's venture into the woods together, metaphorically speaking, and explore every corner of this enduring mystery. Long before European settlers arrived in North America, long before the name Bigfoot or Sasquatch was coined, indigenous peoples across the continent told stories of giant, hairy, human-like beings that lived in the forests and mountains. These were not campfire tales meant merely to frighten children or entertain adults. They were serious accounts woven into the spiritual and practical knowledge systems of numerous tribes. Understanding these indigenous origins is essential to understanding the Bigfoot phenomenon, because they reveal that the legend is not a modern invention, but rather has roots that reach back centuries, perhaps millennia, into the pre-colonial history of North America. The indigenous accounts differ significantly from tribe to tribe, reflecting the diverse cultures and environments of Native American peoples. Some tribes describe these beings as spiritual entities, others as physical creatures, still others as something in between, beings that could move between the physical and spiritual realms. Some traditions portrayed them as dangerous, others as protective, and some as simply another part of the natural world, neither inherently good nor evil. This complexity is often lost in modern discussions of Bigfoot, which tend to focus narrowly on whether a flesh and blood creature exists, while ignoring the rich tapestry of meanings these beings held in indigenous cultures. The word Sasquatch itself comes from the Halkomelem language spoken by Coast Salish peoples of British Columbia. The original word is Saskatches or Saskatches, which translates roughly as wild man or hairy man. For the Coast Salish, these beings were not cryptids in the modern sense, but rather established members of their cosmology and natural world understanding. The Sasquatch occupied a specific ecological and spiritual niche, and knowledge about them was passed down through generations as part of practical survival information and cultural heritage. Coast Salish elders described the Sasquatch as large, powerful beings that generally avoided human contact, but could be dangerous if provoked, encountered unexpectedly, or if humans ventured into areas the creatures considered their territory. There were protocols for what to do if you encountered a Sasquatch. Do not make direct eye contact. Do not run. Back away slowly while making soft, non-threatening sounds. These were not superstitious precautions, but practical advice based on accumulated experience and observation, similar to modern advice about encountering bears or mountain lions. Importantly, the Sasquatch in Coast Salish tradition was not the only type of wild person that existed. Different types of forest beings served different functions in the cosmology, and the Sasquatch represented specifically the physical, terrestrial type, large, hairy, human-like creatures that left footprints, built shelters, and competed with humans for resources like salmon and berries. This specificity suggests the tradition emerged from actual encounters with something, though whether that something was a real creature, misidentified animals, or something else remains the central question. The Lummi Nation, also of the Pacific Northwest coastal region, has extensive traditions about beings they call Tsmequis. These creatures were described as shapeshifters who could appear as humans, animals, or their true form, large, hairy, humanoid beings. The Tsmequis were said to have the power to turn humans into stone, which is why certain rock formations in Lummi territory were avoided and treated with great respect. The Lummi traditions emphasize that Tsmequis were to be treated with extreme caution and respect. They were neither animals to be hunted nor humans to be engaged with socially, but rather beings with their own agency and power that existed alongside humans in a shared but separated world. Disrespecting or harming a Tsmequis could bring terrible consequences not just to the individual, but to their entire family or village. This spiritual dimension is crucial to understanding indigenous Bigfoot lore. For many Native American traditions, the sharp distinction between physical and spiritual, natural and supernatural, did not exist in the way it does in Western scientific thought. A being could be both physically real and spiritually significant, could exist in the material world and the spiritual realm simultaneously. The question, is it real, would be nonsensical from this perspective. Of course it was real, but reality itself was understood more expansively than in the Euro-American framework. The Yakama Nation of Washington State has traditions about giant forest beings that served as guardians of the mountains and forests. These beings were considered protectors of nature who would punish humans who took too much from the land, who killed animals wastefully, or who showed disrespect for the natural world. In this tradition, encounters with these beings were often interpreted as warnings or lessons rather than random events. According to Yakama oral tradition, the giant forest beings lived in the highest, most remote mountain areas that were sacred and generally avoided by humans except for specific spiritual purposes. The beings were said to have a language of their own, communicating through various calls and sounds that echoed through the mountains. They were expert at avoiding detection when they chose to, but they could also make themselves known dramatically when they wanted to send a message to the human community. This role as environmental guardians connects the Bigfoot-type beings to broader themes in Native American spirituality about balance, respect for nature, and the consequences of human excess. The beings were not monsters, but rather enforcers of natural law, reminders that humans were part of a larger ecological community and subject to its rules. This ecological dimension of a legend has particular resonance today as environmental concerns become increasingly urgent. The Iroquois Confederacy nations of the northeastern United States and Canada have traditions about beings called the Stonish Giants or Stone Giants, Otni Yarha in the Oneida language. While these beings differ in some details from the Pacific Northwest Sasquatch, they were said to have bodies covered in scales or stone-like skin rather than hair, and they actively hunted and ate humans. They share the core characteristics of large, bipedal, human-like creatures with superhuman strength that lived in remote areas and represented a threat to human communities. The stone giants feature prominently in Iroquois creation stories and historical narratives. According to tradition, they once were humans who were transformed into monsters as punishment for cannibalism. The stone giants terrorized communities until culture heroes like Hiawatha and the Peacemaker helped unite the Iroquois nations to defend against them. Eventually, the stone giants were driven away or destroyed, though some legends suggest a few survive in the most remote wilderness areas. What's significant about the stone giants tradition is that it locates these beings firmly in historical rather than mythological time. They are not abstract symbols or purely spiritual entities, but rather creatures that actually interacted with human communities in remembered history, even if that history is conveyed through oral tradition rather than written records. This historicity gives the legends a different character than purely mythological stories. These are accounts of real encounters, at least from the perspective of the cultures that preserve them. In Cherokee tradition, particularly in the Appalachian region, stories tell of a being called Judicula, also Tsul'kalu in Cherokee, a giant, hairy hunter who lived in the mountains and possessed supernatural powers. Judicula was said to have 7 fingers on each hand to control the weather and to have jurisdiction over game animals. According to legend, he would punish hunters who killed more than they needed or who showed disrespect to the animals they killed. A massive soapstone rock in North Carolina, covered with mysterious petroglyphs and called Judicula Rock, is traditionally said to be either a place where the giant jumped from a mountain, landing and leaving marks on the rock, or a place where he signed a treaty establishing boundaries between his territory and human territory. The rock exists, and the petroglyphs are real, though their actual age and origin remain debated by archaeologists. For the Cherokee, however, the rock serves as physical proof of Judicula's reality and as a reminder of the agreements and boundaries that must be respected. The Cherokee traditions emphasize Judicula's role as a manager of the game animals and as someone who enforced ethical hunting practices. Like the Yakama Guardians, Judicula was not simply a monster, but rather a being with a specific ecological function, teaching through consequence and enforcement what constituted appropriate human behavior toward nature. In the far north, Inuit and other Arctic peoples have traditions about beings called the Tornit, also Tuniat or in some sources, Tornit-like beings associated with the Dorset culture that preceded the Thule Inuit. These were described as powerful, large people who lived in the Arctic before the arrival of the Inuit ancestors. They were said to be capable of moving huge stones that normal humans could not budge, to be excellent hunters, but also to be somewhat simple-minded compared to the Inuit. According to tradition, the Tornit either intermarried with the arriving Inuit, died out, or retreated to more remote areas. Some stories suggest that a few Tornit or their descendants might still survive in the most isolated regions of the Arctic. These traditions are particularly interesting because they may contain actual historical memory of encounters with the Dorset people, a real archaeological culture that inhabited the Arctic before the Thule Inuit expansion. The fact that the traditions describe them as particularly large and strong might reflect actual physical differences, or might be legendary embellishment. or might refer to their ability to work with stone and bone in ways that seemed remarkable. The northern traditions are important because they show that stories of large, powerful, human-like beings that avoid modern humans are not limited to the forested regions where most Bigfoot sightings occur. They suggest that whatever human need or experience generated these legends is not specific to one environment or region, but rather represents something more universal in the North American indigenous experience. Throughout the Pacific Northwest coast, various Salish-speaking groups use variations of the word skookum to describe powerful spiritual beings, including large, hairy, ape-like creatures of the forest. The word skookum roughly translates to powerful or strong and can be used to describe various supernatural entities, but it frequently refers specifically to the Bigfoot-type beings. These skookum beings were said to possess immense physical strength, the ability to disappear at will, and sometimes the power to control minds or cause illness through spiritual means. The skookum were generally to be avoided, not necessarily because they were actively hostile, but because they were unpredictable and dangerous in the way that any powerful, wild force of nature is dangerous. Encounters with them were seen as ill omens, and places where they were known to frequent were avoided, especially at night or during certain seasons. Coastal traditions often associated skookum with particular locations, certain mountains, deep canyons, remote river valleys. These places became taboo, not to be entered without spiritual preparation and protection, or in some cases not to be entered at all under any circumstances. The spatial dimension of these traditions created a kind of indigenous map of dangerous or powerful locations, a geography based not on resources or elevation, but on spiritual and supernatural presence. When we look across the diverse indigenous traditions of North America, certain patterns emerge that are worth noting. First, nearly every indigenous culture that lived in or near heavily forested regions has some tradition of large, hairy, human-like beings, though the details vary considerably. Second, these beings almost universally occupy an ambiguous category. They are neither fully human nor fully animal, but rather something in between or beyond both categories. Third, they are consistently associated with remote, wild places and with the boundary between civilized/human space and wilderness/natural space. The variations are equally instructive. Some traditions portray these beings as essentially physical creatures with no more spiritual significance than a bear or elk, while others treat them as primarily spiritual entities that might manifest physically. Some traditions describe them as solitary, while others speak of them living in family groups or clans. Some portray them as intelligent, even possessing their own language and culture, while others describe them as more animal-like in their intelligence and behavior. These variations suggest that different indigenous groups were likely describing different phenomena or interpreting similar phenomena in ways that made sense within their distinct cultural frameworks. This diversity undermines any simple reading of indigenous traditions as straightforward evidence for Bigfoot's existence. If they were all describing the same physical creature, we would expect more consistency in the details. At the same time, the commonalities suggest that something, whether a real creature, a common misidentification pattern, a shared cultural archetype, or some combination, was generating these traditions across widely separated cultures. One crucial aspect of indigenous Bigfoot traditions that often gets lost in modern discussions is the lack of separation between sacred and secular, between spiritual and practical. When a native elder says that Sasquatch exists, they're making a claim that cannot be straightforwardly translated into the terms of Western scientific discourse. They're not necessarily claiming that a biological specimen could be captured and studied in a laboratory, nor are they merely speaking metaphorically or symbolically. They are asserting a kind of reality that Western thought struggles to categorize. Many indigenous elders express frustration with the way their traditions are appropriated by Bigfoot researchers who strip away the spiritual and cultural context and treat the beings as merely undiscovered animals to be pursued and captured. From many indigenous perspectives, the very project of trying to capture or kill a Sasquatch is deeply disrespectful and dangerous, displaying the kind of arrogant disregard for boundaries and protocols that the Sasquatch themselves are said to punish. Furthermore, many indigenous teachers emphasize that knowledge about Sasquatch and similar beings should not be shared indiscriminately with outsiders. This knowledge is often considered sacred, meant to be transmitted through proper channels, within appropriate contexts, to those who have the wisdom and cultural grounding to understand it correctly. The commodification of Bigfoot in modern American culture, the reduction of complex spiritual traditions to fodder for television shows and tourist attractions, is seen by many indigenous people as yet another form of cultural exploitation and theft. A key question in evaluating indigenous Bigfoot traditions is how to assess oral tradition as a source of historical information. Western culture, with its emphasis on written records and empirical verification, tends to discount oral tradition as unreliable, subject to embellishment, misunderstanding, and corruption over time. Yet indigenous cultures maintained extremely sophisticated oral tradition systems that preserve information with remarkable accuracy across generations. Oral traditions were not casual storytelling, but rather formal knowledge transmission systems with designated keepers of knowledge, specific protocols for learning and recitation, and built-in error correction mechanisms. Stories were told and retold in communal contexts where elders could correct mistakes. Many traditions used mnemonic devices, rhythmic patterns, and formal structures that aided memory and prevented alteration. Archaeological and linguistic evidence has repeatedly confirmed information preserved in oral traditions that Western scholars initially dismissed as legendary. This suggests that indigenous Bigfoot traditions should be taken seriously as records of something, though what exactly they record remains open to interpretation. They might record encounters with an actual unknown primate species. They might record encounters with known animals under unusual circumstances that were interpreted through cultural frameworks as evidence of supernatural beings. They might record spiritual or psychological experiences that were understood as encounters with other than human persons. They might record a complex mix of all these things, with different layers of meaning and reality intertwined. Another complication in understanding indigenous Bigfoot traditions is the problem of translation, both linguistic and conceptual. When indigenous terms are translated as giant or wild man or ape, we are imposing English words with specific connotations on a concept that may work quite differently in the original languages. The word Sasquatch, now thoroughly absorbed into English, has been stripped of most of its original cultural context and meaning, reduced to simply a name for the North American Bigfoot. More fundamentally, indigenous concepts of what constitutes a being or an entity may differ radically from Western concepts. In many indigenous worldviews, personhood is not limited to humans, but extends to animals, plants, geographical features, and various spiritual entities. All of these can be persons in the sense of having agency, consciousness, and social relationships, even if they are not human persons. Within this framework, Sasquatch might be a kind of person, but that doesn't necessarily make it an undiscovered biological species in the Western scientific sense. Similarly, indigenous concepts of real or exists may not map neatly onto Western scientific concepts. Something can be real and existent without necessarily being material or physical in the way Western science requires. It can be encountered, interacted with, and have effects in the world without being capturable or studyable through scientific methods. This is not primitivism or pre-scientific thinking, but rather a different and in some ways more expansive epistemology, a different theory of what can be known and how it can be known. Today, indigenous people have diverse views on Bigfoot and the contemporary phenomenon surrounding it. Some elders and tradition keepers continue to assert confidently that Sasquatch-type beings exist and that indigenous knowledge about them should be respected as valid and valuable. They may share accounts of recent encounters or of ongoing awareness of these beings in their traditional territories. For them, The failure of Western science to confirm Bigfoot's existence is not evidence that the beings don't exist, but rather evidence that Western science is limited in what it can perceive and understand. Other indigenous people take more skeptical views, suggesting that whatever reality the old stories referred to, the modern Bigfoot phenomenon is largely a product of non-Native American cultures' appropriation and distortion of indigenous traditions. They may see the Bigfoot hunters and researchers as the latest in a long line of white Americans taking what they want from Native culture while ignoring Native people themselves. Still others take middle positions, suggesting that the beings might have existed in the past, but are now extinct, or that they exist in some areas but not others, or that the reality is more complex than either believers or skeptics acknowledge. Many indigenous people are simply tired of the topic, frustrated that outsiders seem more interested in their monster stories than in the real, pressing issues facing Native communities today. Regardless of one's position on Bigfoot's existence, the indigenous traditions provide crucial context for understanding the modern phenomenon. They establish that the legend has deep historical roots in North America, predating European contact by potentially centuries or millennia. They demonstrate that the core concept of large, hairy, human-like beings in the wilderness is not a recent invention, but rather taps into something ancient in North American culture. These traditions also enrich our understanding of what Bigfoot might represent psychologically and culturally. The beings in indigenous traditions are not just mysterious animals, but rather liminal figures that mark boundaries between human and animal, civilization and wilderness, physical and spiritual, known and unknown. They serve multiple functions, as warnings, as guardians, as reminders of human limitations, as teachers of respect and humility. As we move forward in exploring the Euro-American history of Bigfoot legends, it's important to remember these indigenous foundations and to recognize that Native peoples were not just the first to tell Bigfoot stories, but have maintained continuous cultural traditions about these beings right up to the present day. Any complete understanding of the Bigfoot phenomenon must grapple with these traditions, even, or especially, when they challenge Western scientific assumptions about what is real and what is possible. When European settlers pushed westward across the North American continent, they entered lands that were, to them, utterly foreign and frequently terrifying. The dense forests, towering mountains, and vast wilderness seemed to hide dangers at every turn. Hostile native peoples, dangerous predators, harsh weather, and the constant threat of getting lost in terrain where landmarks were few and every direction looked the same. It was in this context of fear, wonder, and radical unfamiliarity that many early Euro-American settlers first encountered stories of large, hairy, man-like creatures in the wilderness. Some settlers heard these stories from Native Americans with whom they traded or lived alongside. Indigenous guides and neighbors would warn them about certain areas, would explain strange sounds in the night, would share their knowledge about the non-human inhabitants of the land. But many settlers dismissed these warnings as superstition, the primitive beliefs of people who didn't understand the natural world with European scientific rationality. This dismissal would have ironic consequences as settlers themselves began to have encounters they couldn't easily explain within their own frameworks of understanding. The 19th century produced a surprising number of written accounts of encounters with strange, ape-like creatures in the American wilderness. These accounts appeared in newspapers, personal letters, journals, and local histories. While some were clearly tall tales or hoaxes, many were presented as serious reports by seemingly credible witnesses. Together, they form an early documentary record that establishes the Bigfoot legend as a persistent feature of American frontier experience, not merely a later invention of the 20th century. One of the earliest documented encounters appeared in the Exeter Watchman newspaper in 1818, which reported on a wild man living in the woods near Ellisburg, New York. According to the account, this creature was described as appearing human but covered in hair and living like a wild animal. While the report doesn't specifically describe the being as gigantic, it established a pattern that would repeat throughout the century. Strange, hairy, human-like beings living in remote forests, avoiding civilization. In 1840, a missionary in the Pacific Northwest named Elkanah Walker wrote about giant beings that local Native Americans described, reporting that they were said to live in the mountains, steal salmon from native fishers, and leave enormous footprints. Walker's account is particularly valuable because he was an educated man whose reports were generally considered reliable, and because he was documenting indigenous beliefs while they were still largely unaffected by later Euro-American influence. As the California gold rush brought tens of thousands of people into previously remote areas of the Sierra Nevada and Cascade Mountain ranges, reports of strange encounters increased dramatically. Mining camps, often located in isolated valleys far from established towns, became hotbeds of strange stories and unexplained encounters. Miners working alone or in small groups in remote areas reported seeing large, hair-covered figures watching them from distances, hearing strange vocalizations, and finding enormous tracks that didn't match any known animal. 19th-century American newspapers operated quite differently from modern media. They were often highly partisan, devoted to political causes, and not particularly concerned with fact-checking or journalistic objectivity as we understand it today. The legend of Bigfoot represents something fundamental about the American experience and the human imagination. Whether rooted in ancient indigenous wisdom, frontier misidentifications, or something else entirely, this enduring mystery continues to captivate millions of people across the nation and around the world. What makes Bigfoot so compelling is not necessarily the question of physical existence, but what the legend reveals about our relationship with the unknown. In an age of satellite imagery, GPS tracking, and genetic analysis, Bigfoot reminds us that mystery still has a place in our world. The creature represents the possibility that not everything can be explained, cataloged, or controlled. That wilderness can still be truly wild. For indigenous communities, these beings have always been more than cryptozoological curiosities. They are part of complex spiritual traditions, reminders of humanity's place within the natural world, and symbols of the boundaries we must respect. The Euro-American appropriation of these traditions into popular culture represents both fascination and, often, cultural insensitivity. The thousands of reported sightings, the countless hours spent searching remote forests, the debates between believers and skeptics, all of this activity creates its own kind of reality. Bigfoot exists as a cultural phenomenon regardless of biological fact. The legend shapes tourism industries, inspires scientific inquiry, however fringe, and provides communities of believers with shared purpose and identity. Perhaps the most important lesson of Bigfoot lore is that humans need mystery. We need to believe that the world is bigger than what we can see and measure. We need wild places that resist our understanding. We need stories that remind us of our limitations and connect us to something primal and ancient. Whether Bigfoot is real or not may be less important than what Bigfoot means. In the forests of the Pacific Northwest, in the mountains of Appalachia, in the swamps of the Deep South, the legend persists. People will continue to search, to believe, to wonder. And in that wondering, they keep alive a sense of possibility that our rational, scientific age sometimes threatens to extinguish. The footprints in the mud, the distant howls in the night, the fleeting glimpses of something large and hairy moving through the trees. These may never yield definitive proof, but they will continue to inspire, to frighten, to fascinate. Bigfoot is America's monster, America's mystery, and America's reminder that no matter how much we think we know, the wilderness still holds secrets. In the end, perhaps that's enough.